armed with more of how and why to think about your business and brand, and less on what to think. And I think all of us will be way more successful, right? And that's kind of and the same applies in your relationships, as well as parenting or any kind of relationship you are looking to maintain. These principles are going to apply. So, okay. A little about me. I am a single dad of 3 girls, 4, 11, and 14, about to be 12 in the middle. I've been an entrepreneur off and on for like 12, 13 years, and I've had a side hustle for 7 or 8 of those years, just kind of dabbling. And my history with podcasting. So I started listening to podcasts in 2009 or 10, so maybe 12 years. Well, before I jump into that, who's heard of a podcast? Everybody? Okay. Who listens to podcasts? Okay, kind of so-so. Who could care less? Because that's okay too. Yeah? Perfect. Perfect. It's great. I love it. And we're done. No. Okay, let's see, show of hands. This will help me. How many people listen to podcasts every week? And it could be 1 podcast, it could be 3. Every week you're listening to something. 3 of you? See how it's 4? See how it's dwindling down? This is interesting. Of you 4, how many of you listen to podcasts, say, a couple hours? A couple hours total for the whole week? At a time?
Sometimes.
Okay.
I do a lot of driving.
Yep, so you're in the car, that's your go-to? Perfect. So now we're down to 1. See, this is proving a lot of my point of where I'm headed. Okay. So the question I'm going to ask you this morning is, should you podcast, should you not? And I don't know if you're looking to me to answer that question this morning, but manage expectations, right? Here's my short answer, these 3 things.
Love it.
I'm going to put that out for you right now.
Everyone, bends in him.
And these 3, and there's probably something here, like if I had enough time to give you backstory, I could tell you how these 3 phrases have impacted my life. I know it's kind of a joke, but it's also not. If I were to write a book, it would be wrapped around these 3 phrases, and if you're interested in that, I can tell you more offline. But these 3 pieces of advice or answers to questions are literally the most frustrating, right, and the most helpful pieces of advice I've ever received. Right? When you're looking for guidance from a mentor or a coach, these are things you don't want to hear. Maybe? Come on. I need a yes or no. It depends? Seriously? That's what you're going to tell me? It depends? What does that even mean? Or I don't know, like the penultimate hated phrase, especially if you're a parent and you have to say, I don't know. It sucks receiving it. Or if you hear, I don't know from your kid, you're like, no, that's not what I asked you, right? But what's powerful about these 3 phrases, that whether you're running a business or you're working for somebody, is these things can empower you to make better decisions, to think properly, to question things you may not be questioning, or to simply pause and think, should I do this? Is this the right fit for me? Is now the right time? Am I the right person for this? And so that's why these can be the most frustrating, but also the most empowering. Because I'm here to tell you guys the answer is not always yes, nor is it always no. Maybe for some things it is. But you are the one that's going to have to determine that, and hopefully I can provide a little bit more insight. So keep those answers in mind the rest of the conversation. All right, quick stats, because I like stats, and if you're a stat guy or girl, you're probably interested too. Right now there's debate about final numbers, but it's close to 4.5 million podcasts. Almost half of those are from Apple. Yes, the top podcasting platform is still Apple. However, Spotify, they've really gained some steam. In fact, I think the year before, Spotify overtook for a couple months, and then Apple came back on. Apple podcasts originated with Apple. Pod, right? iPod, that's where it came from. It was this 2007 or 6. It was essentially an audio file of somebody talking, almost like a radio program that people were putting up online. And then when the Apple iPhone and the iPod, when that released, and then iPhone, it just started to blow up from there. that's where the word podcast came from. Here's probably one of the most important stats you'll hear this morning. 21% are active. So what that means is not even a quarter of those podcasts are updated with new and fresh content that often. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That just means they're not producing the amount of content that the consumers are trying to keep up with. If that makes sense. This is a big one, ad revenue, obviously. So a couple years ago, that was nowhere close to $1 billion, but people are literally throwing cash at podcasting. People are, Spotify purchased a company 3 years ago, and paid $250 million for a podcasting company. Let me try to set this stage for you. These are two guys that literally woke up one day and were like, hey, we should start a company producing podcasts for people. And everybody was like, this is dumb. Number one, nobody's going to want this. 5 years into that, they had, 100 employees, multiple shows, highly produced episodes, and Spotify writes them a check for $250 million. So, okay, podcasting means something. So this is projected to double by next year because companies like Nike and Disney and Netflix and all kinds of companies are throwing money now at podcasting. 60% of US consumers listen to a podcast, so that's not quite close to where we were, but it's not too far. It's pretty close. And then what's interesting is it's been mostly white males for a long time. I couldn't tell you why, but the demographics are diversifying, which is really encouraging, right? The African American and Hispanic base and female listeners are all demographics that are exploding, which is good because those people are giving a voice. They're the ones behind the mic now, which is starting to create a lot of momentum. And then I can send you guys the slides if you're interested in digging. There's dozens of more stats at these two websites here. Any thoughts or questions here? Pretty straightforward. All right. I could go into so much detail this morning, and Gemma could probably tell you, it's stuff that would bore you about technology, software, hardware. I mean, I know all the things, and if you want to know that, that's great. Ask those questions. I'm not really going to get into that with this because I feel like it's way less important. But please, if you have questions about what microphone should I use and what software should I start with, and if I don't know the answer, Gerald could probably tell you 3 times better than I could. And yeah, there you go. So you got an awesome mic? Yeah, perfect. Which one do you use?
The Yeti Blue.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the same one that I use. We're best friends now.
It's not the cup.
You should be best friends. He's a great guy.
Not the cup. Yeti.
No.
Not just Yeti.
No. But if you buy enough mics, you get a free cooler. All right, so real quick, 3 things that you need to podcast. This is probably the most important thing I'm going to share this morning. Not in a particular order, but these 3 things, right? Your time is huge. Second is, do you feel like you have a compelling enough story to tell? And again, like I'm not here to tell you yes or no. That's totally up to you. Does everybody need a podcast? No. Not everybody needs a podcast. Right? I thought you were encouraging people to do podcasts.
Or a YouTube channel.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Because video is king, right? So we all need YouTube channels. So do you have a compelling enough story to tell, whether it's about you or about your brand or whatever you're trying to accomplish? And then finally, it sounds maybe a little nuanced, but you got to believe in yourself, guys. I mean, if you started a brand or a business, some level of believing in yourself, call it egomania, it doesn't really matter. Call it, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, there you go. That's a good one. If you have enough guts and grit and belief in yourself to be like, I think I can do this, then that's a key part of doing something like this because you're launching essentially a new marketing arm to your business, which is a big deal. So if you don't believe in yourself, this is going to be a struggle, right? The imposter syndrome is real, and if you can't overcome that, it's going to be a challenge for you to even want to think about following through. You'll be back in the category of the people who haven't produced a show in 6 months. It's called pod fading. It's a real thing in the industry. I think the average is 7 to 10 episodes, give or take, and then you never hear from that person again. Yeah, it's a real struggle. There's a lot of layers to podcasting. There's software, there's hardware, there's distributing it, there's marketing it, there's advertise. Are you going to advertise? Are you going to pay money? Are you going to talk about it Are you going to do it live? Are you not going to do it live? Are you going to add video? Are you not going to add video? How are you going to get guests? Are you going to schedule? So again, I'm not trying to scare you, but I am kind of trying to scare you a little bit because it's a big deal. So these are questions I'm sure you guys have asked, but yeah, how active do you want to be? So time. Life happens. You make plans and then life happens, right? So like, you know, you're going to have to do some research. And you might have kids at the table. You might be researching on your phone while you're grilling meat for the family, Joe. You know,
Or for your entrepreneur friend.
right? You might be Gerald. You're at the football game. You're trying to enjoy the kids. You're also videoing and you're also researching this next thing on your phone. You know, you're going to have to multitask. You're going to have to figure this thing out. So do you even have the time on the front end dedicated to? And Joe's like, no.
We talked about this.
Yeah. And this, all of this is meant to not put burden on you, or as much as it is to like release you from like, can you really do this? If you do have the time, fantastic. It's totally worth it because it becomes something that is an outlet, becomes something you can give your voice to. We'll talk about that in a minute. It becomes something that you'll see an investment from that time if you stick with it. But again, I wouldn't even launch into a podcast until you can take an honest audit of your schedule. And only you can do that, or your spouse, or those who are like, you want to start a podcast, honey? When are you going to do that? I'll do it between dinner and washing dishes.
So it's really a prioritization of time.
Yeah, it is. That's why I say audit. Like, you have to take a look at your schedule and figure, are there gaps? Just like budgeting. I mean, hey, are we going to add this new thing to our budget? Then what has to go? Or what do we have room for? Like, if you can let things go, all of us, let's be honest, we can let things go to make time for what we need to do, but it's just a matter of, are you going to, and what kind of time do you have? Yeah.
What are expectations of when a return would be?
Depends on what kind of return, like what return are you looking for? Are you talking financial return? Are you talking number of customers, listeners? If you launch a podcast and you are consistent, I think I've talked with Jim about this. If you can stick to 2 a month, say for 6 months, so you produce 12 episodes, the average number of listeners per episode is anywhere from 50 to like 1,000, and you're in that range, you can start to see a return in 3 months, 4 months. People reaching out, good listeners, as long as you're consistent, which is where the time comes in. If you can't produce consistently, then it's probably not worth it. Yeah.
How much time would you say goes into one episode? I know it's a very broad question.
Yeah, some of that depends too.
It depends. Maybe the first, maybe, I don't know. But like, because I'm sure you edit and all that kind of stuff as well. So
Mhm.
all that.
Yeah, whether I'm editing somebody's podcast or you're editing your own, 30 minutes is usually about 2 hours worth of production. I'm intermediate level. I'm not like professional. So professional could probably do it faster. I mean, if you're going to produce an hour show, which is really long,
No, 30
at least.
you're not a pro editor.
At least. I don't know if you would agree or disagree with that.
My conversations with people about podcasts is it starts with understanding, like, I work primarily with the voice acting community, so their needs for recording something was extremely different than a podcast. Because everything about them had to be pro quality. It was like super pristine environment, very specific equipment, things like that. Whereas with podcasting, it really, when he says the maybe and it depends on that, that's really so foundational to it that Jimmy could do one, and Casey could do one, and they could both have successful podcasts, and they could have absolutely nothing in common except that there's a microphone involved. There are environmental considerations, like I said, on one extreme, like a voice actor would have a very pristine, but you could have a successful podcast, and literally we could sit out here on the curb and record it if we were talking about traffic in Woodstock, and the sounds around us are traffic in Woodstock, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are things that you could leverage about that, but there aren't a lot of rights or wrongs. So what I usually end up telling people is your podcast should be an authentic extension of you.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's really about you. You can't necessarily hit a target with it because ultimately you're creating something that has to attract people to it. You know, you're really exposing them to the fact that you exist if you're advertising and marketing. But if you start trying to say, I'm going to reach a certain market, then it's a slightly different positioning that you're taking, because now you're trying to create a podcast based on what you think people want. The
Yeah.
problem is, that's a very broad thing to try to hit. So when it goes back to saying being authentic, like the picture up here, say if it's the mom, and she's having a podcast about being a mom at home with kids, right? A kid being in the background, nothing.
Not a big deal, yeah.
We're talking about, oh my God, I gotta go deal with these kids. Nothing, because ultimately other moms are gonna hear that. Yeah, I feel it. Let me tune in and see what's going on this week. So her tribe will eventually start to gravitate toward that. Now imagine she does it for 6 months and she says, oh, no, I'm gonna start doing something different. Well, now she may attract a different tribe, which means her existing tribe goes away or fades to some extent, while maybe she eventually does attract another one. But if she's just being authentic to her life experience, then if there's a market there and she's putting it in front of the right people, it will grow. Some things are just going to take longer to ramp up. Some things may take off immediately because maybe there's nobody else speaking to that. But it still comes back to your individuality
Yeah.
and what you're trying to do, even if it's the business. Jim's doing one with Rejoice Maids. As long as she's consistent with that and talking about her experiences with cleaning and the market, she can have a podcast. Nothing about crazy clients. Oh my God, you're not gonna believe this when I happen this week. Just smiling. Right. And people would tune in over time. They're like, yeah, that lady, did you hear her talking about, whatever, like that? And she's more of a value add, so she's more likely to talk about basic cleaning and upbeat things, but she would need to be consistent with that because ultimately she would start to attract a tribe based on that. So,
Yeah, it's a good
It
point.
also depends on your goals.
Right.
What is it you want to accomplish?
Yeah, it's true.
You can just keep putting it out there, but if you don't know where you're going, you don't have a roadmap, then it's not
Mm.
working.
That's why you start with it, just seeing it as an extension of what you do. Because I think when people, the people who seem most frustrated with it, try to approach it as a money-making venture.
That's
Like,
everything.
I'm gonna do this,
Yeah.
this, and this, and then I'm looking for my return.
Yes, yes.
It's hard to be authentic with that because
Yes.
you're trying to triangulate, you're trying to calculate, well, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm ultimately gonna get people to pay me money.
Yes.
Well, now, no, do something authentic to what you do. If you're an auto mechanic or a realtor,
Yes.
just talk about what it is you do
Give.
and be consistent with that.
Right.
Getting paid is just icing on the cake at that point.
Yeah. And as far as the quality stuff is concerned, quite frankly, I think when you're starting off, don't stress over it. Because frankly, people will give you credit for just being authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And in most cases, if you listen to even your most favorite podcasts or anything, even YouTube channels, I use this example a lot. If people follow a particular YouTube channel, you look at them today. I challenge you to go to their video list, sort it chronologically, and go to the beginning. And see how that compares.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a polished product that they've cultivated over a 5-year period, but when they started, they looked like
Yeah.
crap. And you're like, oh my God, I can't believe
Right?
this is the same show.
Yeah.
That's so
It's true.
A
Yeah.
perfect example is Dude Perfect. They were college kids and they didn't even keep whatever they were shooting in the frame.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one, it was hysterical.
Yeah.
And now you
They've got a production team.
Right,
Yeah.
now
Yeah.
it's crazy sauce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true.
And so that's the
That's
nice
a
part
good
is that
thought.
you,
Just
What,
have
I
to
mean,
start.
starting is starting. It's never going to be pretty. In fact, it's probably going to be crappy. It's probably going to sound crappy. It's probably going to look crappy. But believe it or not, though, but some of that, have you ever looked at something and you wish people just didn't try all the production stuff? Like, can you just set the camera in one place? I love what you have to say, but the fact that you're trying to do so many things and switch angles and do all this stuff, it's distracting. Now you've lost me with your effort to polish something that I can tell isn't polished, right? But if you just start, just be authentic with it, over time, you will find ways to tweak your process, and you'll find other people that buy into that, and you'll improve, and then you'll see those shows that you see today, which are nicely produced
And you
Yeah.
start getting paid.
edited.
There's our end goal there.
Well, and so there's obviously time hacks too, right? Like thinking about what Gerald said. Yeah, if you were to just jump into it and start, you can actually do it in a relatively short amount of time if you're good with your time management. Like here's ways to batch out podcasts. I always tell people, like, if you have an hour or 2 hours, just go ahead and plan out the couple episodes or topics and record in that period of time. And then you're ahead of your production schedule. Not everybody can do that. Things come up. But there's things like that you can do. Or this is a mobile podcast kit. You can literally stick it to somebody, go to a coffee shop, go on the run, and record a podcast, and this is it. This is the microphone. You don't need all the wires. So there's ways you can do it that's easy and is smart with your time. But it is a time commitment because you have to be consistent. It's just like people who launch one YouTube video, like, I tried it, it didn't work. I'm like, wait a minute, you did one video and it, okay. Yeah, I think your expectations are a little off, right? Like that's like people who are like, I did one billboard for 1 month and I got 3 sales. I'm like, who told you you had to do one billboard for 1 month? You should have done it for 6 months. Right there in the same spot. So people drive by and it's like a memory burn. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so go ahead, Nick, sorry.
Regarding time, is there a best practice length of podcast that is most consumable?
20 to 40 minutes is the average right now, yeah. Obviously, you can look at 20, 40 minutes and be like, well, I listen to one that's 10. Well, that's outside of the norm. Or Joe Rogan's 3.5 hours. I mean, he's Joe Rogan. Like, he's not the standard. And he's also gets paid millions of dollars. He's not the standard.
And just because it's longer or shorter doesn't mean somebody has to consume it all at one time either.
Yeah, there's a stat I didn't throw up there. I think almost 70% of people finish an episode, which is kind of surprising to me. I'm like, what happened? What? I mean, we're an ADD culture. Maybe that's part of it, or maybe that's like people who are like, I read most of the book. I don't need to read the rest.
Tell a thought on that. How long are you in a car on average going from point A to point B?
I lost some.
Half an hour.
Yeah,
So
give or take.
I always say, especially when you're starting out, because if you say 40 minutes, it doesn't sound like a huge amount of time, but when you try to produce 40 minutes,
Sure.
it's more than it thinks. But if the average drive maybe around here, say 10 to 15 minutes or something, maybe 15 minutes, if you start there and you're consistent with it, as your content base grows, maybe you start to do interviews or something like that, then you can extend the time. But I think if you started maybe at that 10 to 15 minute range, again, thinking about what the typical drive is. If a person's driving primarily to Atlanta, it might be 40 minutes to an hour, right? At least. So I would say ideally, if you could make it to a length to where a person can start it and finish it in a ride.
Yeah, some of that depends on your personality. If you're like, I don't have much to say past 10 minutes, then why force it?
Yeah.
And some of this topic, like some people can go on for hours about one basketball game, one basketball team. I can't get enough. And somebody might be like, I'm good with a 10-minute sports update, and then I'm done. It just depends on what feels natural, but also topic based. Like if you got a podcast on mental health, you're going to be going much longer than 10 minutes, right?
Sure.
10 minutes point is like the intro.
Right, yeah.
And then you're like, oh my gosh, they're talking about neuroscience and mindfulness, and that's going to be a long episode. Yeah. Good question. Yeah, keep them coming. This is good. All right, next thing obviously is your story. So obviously this is a loaded word, but we've come a long way. Business, brands, everybody's talking about story and storytelling, which is good because it's got us back to what kind of makes us human. Like we used to learn only based on stories. Sit around the campfire. Before there was books even, this is how we interacted with each other through stories. Sit around a meal, around a campfire at night, and we tell stories. And we would listen to stories. So the question is, do you have a compelling enough story? You don't have to be a fantastic storyteller, but is the story you're trying to tell, whether it's about yourself or the topic, compelling enough? Obviously, there's ways to make it compelling. There's tips and tricks you could learn. But the overall question is, what is your story, and what's the story you're trying to tell, and can you do it in a compelling way? And a lot of people opt to do that through the art of interviews. I mean, I think most podcasts out there, they're interviewing somebody else, and that person is an aid, a huge aid in telling that story, right? Because it's based on a conversation.
So what is one of the things that helps you help people decide which of those routes is best? Okay, this fits best for you just sitting there and talking, or this really, is it topic-based, is it personality-based, does it depend,
Yeah.
what have you seen as far as that goes?
What I usually base it off of is personality.
Okay.
Yeah. Some people are they can carry it. They're compelling, their personality is interesting, they're good at communicating, they can get points across. That person can probably hold a show pretty well, but some people aren't. You need somebody to feed off of. Like I can communicate on my own, but I'd much rather feed off of somebody else, whether it's one-on-one or in a group. That's kind of my jam. I get worn out. I'm like, how long do I have to talk on this one thing, right? So I think that's how I determine it, based on personality. Yeah. And comfort. I mean, what are you comfortable doing?
Yeah.
Some people, you can grow into it.
Yeah.
It's terrifying interviewing people. It really is. But I love it. Every time I eat it up, I just start pulling stories out of them, and I'm curious. And so it just kind of depends on your personality. Yeah, but definitely goals.
Yeah.
So if you were to do a podcast where you interview people, how would you go about getting people to interview? Because I can have a podcast, but nobody cares about it. So let's say someone that's well established. Why would I go and talk to your podcast?
You mean, so like how to get guests?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and especially if you're starting out, which is one answer compared to if you're not. I mean, I'll tell you what I did. It's a lot of cold calling, cold emailing.
Oh, yeah.
If somebody you really want to have on your show, you might have to chase them.
Okay.
I did a couple things in the beginning, like I launched an intro episode, which was a hack, a way for me to say it's already launched. Instead of saying it's coming out, people are like, it's coming out? Unless you know that person, they might not give you the time of day. If you already got like an intro or a sneak peek or a trailer, you can use that or design some kind of cover art that goes with your ask. That way they're like, okay, David's pretty serious. He's already launched and he's got a vision for this thing. That's a way to do it if you're starting out. But there are so many tools, softwares, marketing hacks, ways to grab people, do a review for their book and then talk about how you just left them a review, or hey, I've been listening to your podcast. And anytime you can talk about how they've impacted you specifically, that's usually a foot in. Otherwise, it's just a complete cold email, and they're like, I mean, who is this guy? I don't know him.
Yeah, because I see some podcasts, I'm like, dang, how did they get that person on there, Because that's
Some,
like
yeah.
a good hitter. And
Right? Yeah, some of it's luck.
So,
I think some people get lucky. You might have caught them on a good day, but sometimes you're going through gatekeepers too, and that's tough. Like publisher, or you're going through a marketer. Yeah.
And sometimes the way to get the big guest is to have a bunch of small guests in a row, so that you're actually consistent, you're
Yep.
serious. and
There you go.
not-
Mhm.
Alright, so you've done 3 episodes, you're just trying to get me what's.
Yeah, I think that's,
Consistency
I
plays
think
into it.
that's a really big thing.
Yeah.
When people start off, they sometimes want to chase the big thing,
Mhm.
and that can be the worst thing for you.
Yeah, because you might not even be ready for that.
And you're not experienced enough
Right.
for it. And you're still in the training wheels, and you're trying to get somebody who's driving a race car, right? But yeah, when you're looking for those first ones, you want to find the friendly, type person.
so inner circle.
A lot of people want to talk about it.
Everybody in my inner circle.
Because that's why people want to talk about what they do or their experiences, and it's easier for them to have a conversation about it than maybe to present about it, or something like that. So bringing them in, then you're both getting something, right? They're getting some exposure for what they're talking about. You're getting some experience, and now it's just about going through the interview process. And then the more you do it, the better you get at it. The more you do it,
Yeah, for sure. That's what I was going to say, the art of interviewing. I mean, there is an art to it. I would say most people in my experience don't say no to being on a podcast unless they're big enough or they're just too busy, because they get so many requests. They're like, here's the 1,000th podcast request today. So now it's like, how do I choose which one to say yes to? And they're going to choose people who've been consistent or have had, or there's a connection. Yeah.
so I don't think it'd be hard to do.
I mean, you can get it, but it's gonna.
It's going to cost. I'm bringing my kids with me. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah. So keep it PG, whatever we're talking about.
He'll bring his for as well.
Yes. So, I mean, obviously, if you're not clear on your own personal story, you're not comfortable with your story, I mean, let's just be honest for a second. Don't get behind a mic. Like, can we just be honest? Like, it's okay. No shame. Don't get behind a mic if you don't want to tell any of your story. I mean, I guess you could, in an imaginary world, you get behind a mic, never once talk about your own story and only talk about other people's stories. But I don't know how long you'd be able to get away with that until somebody was like, I really don't know who you are, so I don't trust you. So, I mean,
Does every podcast have a story? Like, if, say for instance, if Nick and I wanted to have a podcast about sports, right? It's not necessarily about our story as much as us talking about sports.
yeah.
So how does that relate to
What's
you?
the story you're trying to tell, though, about that sports? I mean, I feel like, not to water down the meaning of story, but like narrative. Who's the hero in this journey? What are the problems we're trying to solve? Where are we going? Are there guides along the way? So like using the hero's journey as a way to understand every podcast. I think if you understand it that way, and even a sports podcast, like what's the narrative you're trying to create around sports? Are you talking about a certain player? Are you talking about the rules that are jacked up? Are you talking about how somebody got paid off? Are you talking about a scandal? Are you just commentating sports? I mean, I think there's an overarching story that you're trying to tell about that podcast and about that episode or about that person. That's kind of the way I think about it. So in that aspect, it's all telling some kind of story. And even if it's not, you're at least telling a story about yourself, right? I know Gerald, this guy knows sports. Wow, okay, I like the way he thinks about, right? They're going to walk away with some kind of narrative.
For the record, I probably listen to that too.
All right. So today's goal is for Gerald to launch a podcast.
With all your free time.
Does that make sense? Or any questions or further thoughts on story and how to, and why to tell a compelling one?
I think it's interesting that you mentioned story, because I think sometimes the story, if you're doing an interview, it's the story of the other person on the other side, primarily, because that's why you're doing the interview, then you flip it back and put your own interjections on your life experience as well. So over time, your story does come out, you know, and maybe that's the interesting part. You know, I think that can be said too, but if you're gonna be you by yourself looking in a screen, ranting and raving about whatever you want to rant and rave about, at some point, either you're going to dial in and love it, or they're going to dial off and delete it. So, you know,
Yeah.
so.
Some of that depends on the listener. Some people are like, I don't care anything about your story. I'm just here to learn about your real estate tips. Okay, well, that's fine. It all depends on goals and alignment, right? But you're also asking, how do I frame this podcast and the story we're trying to tell in a way that connects to the story of the listener? And I think that's what makes it powerful. I'm listening to your podcast. If this doesn't connect to my story at all, yeah, I'm not going to last very long. So the onus is kind of on the host. Like, you got to figure out how to do that. And it's not meant to be scary. It's just like, that's part of it. So for example, if you go back to those stat links that I had up on the stat screen, one of them talks about the top 50 podcasts in 2022. And I'd say at least 50%, maybe even 60% of those top 50 are all highly produced shows, story-based. They're crime shows, they're sports history shows. They're all based on people telling these huge stories because people crave it. Or it's a mental health thing and it's got stories attached to it or whatever. So, does that make sense?
I think NPR spends on radio ad, it could be anywhere from $100,000 to $150,000 or more
Per
on
ep.
travel expenses on a 6-month engagement to do a 45-minute podcast sometimes. So it's pretty crazy. They spend quite a bit of money, but they'll go to the deep, dark depths of a country and interview people and then bring the story out and go here. And so they'll bounce around and tell the story and still interject their ads in between, which make it interesting. So.
Yeah, so here's an interesting point about, is podcasting legit? 2 power couples, okay? You ready? Former President Barack Obama and his wife Michelle, right? They have a storytelling nonprofit, maybe? I can't remember if it's a nonprofit, but focused on literally telling stories, and part of that includes podcasts. I'm like, why does a former president even care about podcasts? Yeah, I mean, obviously there's money attached to it, but that's interesting. And then I don't know how you feel about the Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. I know it's a touchy subject. Oh my gosh. You know, everybody's getting canceled these days about everything. I'm like, all right, guys. They've invested time and money in a similar thing. They've got a media nonprofit. They're trying to tell people stories and involves podcasts. I'm like, that's really interesting to me, these 2 power couples that are involved in stories. So, I mean, that really says something about where our culture is headed and what people crave. And the last thing, obviously, is believe in yourself. I mean, yeah, it's not going to work. You have all the time in the day and a compelling story, but if you just can't get past yourself or this imposter syndrome or that's, I'll just be honest, that's something I've struggled with for years. Who am I to start a podcast? Like, well, who is anybody? Let's be honest. Why not you is really the better question, through the lens of, do you have time, do you have a story? But of course, you have to believe in yourself or it's not going to work. Yeah, there's only one Gerald, right? There's only one Elizabeth, there's only one Joe, there's only one Justin, and nobody else can be you. There's only one David. And so it's all about being it's all about being yourself, and then being, like Gerald said, that authentic version of yourself, and that is what's going to naturally attract a tribe of people that are like, David's my guy. I get that guy. There's another person in the world that thinks like I do. He's walked through I do. You may only have 10 listeners. I don't care. But you might have 10 avid fans that are like, these are your people, right? And to me, that's worth it. Yeah, exactly. And that's worth way more than 1 million listeners, 999,000 that are like,
This speaks to the importance of expectations going into it. Because if you're going in thinking that in 2 months you're going to have 1 million downloads, it's going to be hard to believe in yourself for very long when that doesn't happen.
that's true, yeah.
So that's why it ties back to the being authentic with you, because if you can just be you all the time, then you're just doing this as an extension of that. Whatever you're doing for your podcast is an extension of that. So it's easier to do it for a longer period of time. And I don't know that I've seen people that come and say, hey, I tried the podcast and didn't get the bomb. I'm like, really? What happened? And so, well, I looked at my analytics and they just weren't there. I said, well, how many did you do? I just did one.
Right.
I said, you did one podcast
Yeah.
and you were looking at analytics. Nobody knew you existed, right? Yeah. So, but
Yeah.
your expectations was that I'm going to do this thing, and this thing is just going to blow up and go viral and all this stuff. That's not really how it works. And
Yeah.
You have to invest.
And
Yeah.
I think what you said give. I feel like it's not about greed, it's about giving. And I feel like that's for everything we do. Social media, we start looking around and we're like, we got one like. It's like, oh.
But that's the cool part. That's the cool part about something like podcasting is that no one can tell you what type of podcast to make, right? You could pick something that's, like your story is very unique. If you go in and you're talking about just your life experiences, the kids, the system, the different things, people are gonna be drawn to that because somebody out there had a similar experience, and maybe they're in the middle of their experience, and they just love listening to someone talk that they feel gets them. And it's not hard for you to, it may be a challenge just putting together the programming part, but the story and the passion and the meaning of it is all natural. It's all you, right? And so that's, I think, what it has to go into when it's a podcast. It's like your private radio station. It's all about you.
That's actually one of, may I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the difference between like Business X Radio, they record theirs,
Mm-hmm.
and podcasts? Are they the same and I just don't understand that?
Not really. A podcast essentially, okay, so what Business Radio X records an audio program, file, whatever, and they put it up on a website. Until they put it out to a podcast app, it's officially not a podcast. I'm not saying they're not doing podcasting, but that's kind of how it's seen, is it's got to go out to the podcasting apps. Does that mean if you record an audio and you put it on your website, it's not a podcast? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it needs to live inside of the library with the rest of the podcast to kind of get treated as a podcast.
So Jared was on Business X.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I would
did
have
he-
called it a podcast. I would have
Okay.
called it generally if he did a podcast. Yeah.
Okay.
If it never ends up on the podcast app, then it's like,
I don't listen to yours yet. I did listen to yours.
But I did say, I meant with you.
Yeah.
is that I think it's a podcast. but
Right.
Instead of being hosted in a podcasting app, to leave a podcast, you go to their specific website and you listen to it. It's essentially the same format. It's an interview, conversation happening between 2, 3, 4 people. They're sharing information. They're learning more about each other, each other's stories. So if you choose to put it on a podcast app, that's great. Then maybe you call it a podcast. But if it's on a website, people have websites all day long, and you may never find them. That's the thing. You have to market
it's
that
more like a
website.
cat-
You do
yeah.
Like a
SEO.
catalog of it.
It's a catalog, and they have a huge catalog of people they've interviewed. So it's radio to
Radio,
them,
yeah.
called Radio X. And I
Right.
think that's there where they're staying, and that's their lane they want to be in, and that's good. But over here, if I were to start one, to get the maximum visibility for me, Joe, I'm going to lean toward Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, all these other apps out there that aggregate podcasts and put them in front of the most amount of people.
Yeah.
That's just would be my personal
Okay.
choice.
Okay.
But again, nothing against business right
It's a little, I mean, it's a little bit of hair splitting. So like
Okay.
you could produce a video show from your garage every week and it lives on YouTube. Is that a video show? Of course it is. Is it a Netflix show? Not yet. And so, yeah, it's all about distribution.
Where it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
So think of it as, where is this radio show, where is this interview distributed? And if technically as a podcast, it has to be distributed into like podcast channels.
Okay.
That's at least how it's treated. How are we on time?
We
Almost
got
done?
8 minutes. Go
All right.
for it.
So if I started with the first half of like, here's what you would need, or more of the negative-ish side, not really negative, then this would be the last part. Like, here's how it can actually help you if you're seriously considering this. Marketing, trust, and funnel. And I'll break out each one real quick. Okay. Podcasting obviously is a huge way to market your brand, right? Whether you're doing what Gemma's doing, or you're thinking this is an extension, or this is a brand new thing, you're launching a new product, startup, service, whatever. This is a massive way to market your brand, just because podcasting has grown and money is being thrown at it and people are seeing it as a legit medium, but it's literally a huge way to be in front of people about who this brand is. There's extensions of that I would say, like, you're giving voice to your brand, literally. I tell people, like, you're literally attaching a voice to your brand, whether you're the founder or you're the communications person, which leads into this. To me, the biggest thing about podcasting is you're distributing trust. Something happens when you go from experiencing a business or brand, reading their email, just any kind of text, email, newsletter, magazine, social media posts. If it's all texts, that's a great interaction. But as soon as it goes from reading to hearing somebody's voice, something happens, guys. It's a human medium. When you hear somebody's voice, trust begins to be distributed automatically. Why do you think somebody says, I've got this book I wrote, and I'm a best-selling author, and all of a sudden they're on a podcast and you hear them tell their story? Within an instant, you feel a connection to that person because you're just hearing a human speak, and it does something. It causes trust to go up. And obviously, above audio, video does even more, right? Because you can, this is the ultimate in the room. Second closest is video. Third close to that is probably audio. So, yeah.
I was going to say something to add to that, also with the authenticity we were talking about earlier. I think a lot of times people just want somebody, that relates to them, that's
Yeah.
relatable. So when you talk about picking that story, just be yourself, tell that story, and people are going to be drawn to that.
Yeah.
And there you go.
Yep.
Right? Because a lot of us go through different losses. You better stop that.
No, look behind you, you'll understand. They're having their own show.
I was going to send my mom a video or something.
Right?
Your mama video.
So you're like, no, you're good. No. So, yeah, I mean, that you just have to, like, do I feel like my business is distributing trust enough or properly? Or, like, if you're thinking of launching one, you've got a coaching business, you just have to ask that question to yourself, or maybe even ask your closest clients. Do you trust me? I do trust you. Why do you trust me? Okay, if I did a podcast and talked and you heard my voice, would it increase your trust? You just have to ask questions and be willing to test. But I'm telling you, something happens. And you go from experiencing a brand, reading it, to hearing it.
This gives you credibility.
Exactly.
You become an expert in your field if you concentrate in one topic that you want to keep digging and showing and giving, and you become an expert. Then your brand goes up.
Right. Yep. Your brand reputation, your integrity. Yeah. And you can suddenly, the people can relate to you.
Now there's studies out there that talk about audio and how it triggers parts of your brain, like if you're listening, and I'm not trying to distract,
Yeah.
but as you're listening through stories, if you have no sight, it triggers imagination.
Yeah.
It triggers the way your brain's processing the information that it's hearing. And so there's something about the way you absorb information through hearing. So podcast being mostly audio, it allows you to be able to focus on that and still be able to do other things, but at the same time interpret it in different ways. So again,
Yeah, I
if
think,
you're communicating trust and integrity and all your brands through that, it's something the way it does with the brains.
there's definitely something to that. I would agree. I'm glad you brought that up. There's neuroscience has grown quickly in the last few years, and there's stuff out there, studies that talk about the part of your brain that activates the imagination essentially shuts down when you're watching video, which is kind of scary, really. Like, okay, but I don't have to imagine. Like, if I'm going to watch Lord of the Rings, why do I need to imagine anything? It's literally playing out in front of me. But if I listen to Lord of the Rings audiobook, all of a sudden that engages your imagination. Now you're like, how do the hobbits actually look? And your brain starts to activate. There's research out there that talks about that. That's why I typically argue for an audio podcast personally, because I'm like, how do we maximize the engagement with this listener? Man, let's get their imagination activated when they're talking to you, because now their mind can wander, which is what you want. Now you're talking to me about all these coaching things, and now my mind is wandering. Oh my gosh, that's so good. That made me think of this interaction I had the other day with my team. I need to go do that. But if I'm watching you on video, I'm engaged, but I'm not really thinking. I'm just kind of listening. Yeah, so there's something to that.
Oh, man, interesting one with that one, because have you all ever had that experience where you have there's a radio personality or maybe an artist that you love their music, you love listening to them on the radio, but then you meet them in person one day and you're like, it's never the same.
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden, you can't hear them the same way anymore.
Yeah.
And so I had a chance sometimes where people say, hey, such and such is in the building, you want to meet them? I'm like, nope. Like, why not? It's like, for me, they fit a certain place for me. Once I meet them, you know, it just changes the dynamics.
Yeah,
For
it's true.
I want to like them over here, and I'm happy with that.
So there's a radio show, it's called Adventures in Odyssey. It's a kid's thing. It's been on for 40 years.
Oh, I see.
All right, 40 years.
Watch that.
And listen to it like over and over, and I had this image, and we happened to go on a cruise that they were there. And the dude who's my son and my favorite character is like this goofy mailman who's like kind of nutty on the show. He comes out, I am not kidding you, he looked like Kiss. Like, hair, it made it better actually for
Did it really?
But it was never in a million years with that voice, but I now can't listen to it anymore
Without picturing him.
without
Yeah.
seeing him.
Right.
So I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
You don't want to ruin.
And again, I mean, it also depends on what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
Like if it's not super important like if you have to have video, great, go for video. I'm not saying one's worse than the other, but and then the last thing is obviously a funnel. So some people don't have a funnel at all still with their business, okay? But if you're looking for a pretty effective funnel because you're distributing trust, that's a huge one, right? Because now you're getting people that are reaching out and they're like, man, I heard your podcast. What do I do now? I feel like I want to talk to you. I want to buy all your products. I'm ready. Sign me up. This is a way to funnel those fans in big time.
So what I'm seeing on like TikTok and things is usually people have TikToks first and then they typically get a podcast, at least people I follow. Is that because they're trying to get more trust from their audience, or is it TikTok's an easier thing to start with to kind of jump in and then they move to the...
It's definitely easier, right? You just grab your phone. Grab your phone and an editing app and you can go to town on TikTok. Podcasting's definitely got some more humps. You got to walk through equipment and software.
Right.
And anybody can do a TikTok video.
So is it, okay, I go viral on TikTok, now I have the ability to market and the ability to spend the money to go ahead and podcast?
I don't know. I don't know if it translates. I'm not sure.
Have you studied that? Like,
No, I have not. I have not studied. The things that I've studied about TikTok have mostly been negative. That's the approach I've studied. I'm not saying it's all negative.
you're accurate.
I'm not saying TikTok is negative. I'm saying I've only studied the negative side, the effects of it.
Yeah.
As far as effective, I think it's very effective, obviously. I mean, you can be in front of... Yeah.
I think it's like most of the social
Because if you
media,
get on the
though,
comedian
they
side
have a
of
different.
TikTok.
Sure,
clean
yeah,
TikTok,
right.
I've seen I get on some rabbit holes of
Yeah,
how to keep my
absolutely.
house better, or who to look for in a cleaner, but
That's why it's so effective. I think if like for Gemma, it probably makes a lot of sense.
yes.
Depends on what you're trying to accomplish, who you're trying to reach, right? If nobody has that voice on TikTok, go for it. Or if it's a growing, like the dad audience is growing on TikTok, so I'm like, that makes sense, go for it. I don't think it's for me personally, but whatever. I think it just
What
depends.
is the price tag if any of us wanted to like, hey, we just want to try this, and I mean the commitment, like do a 6-month commitment, what would that price tag look like if someone was going to budget for it? And the dollar signs, not the time. The time would be our
Dollar signs?
Yeah, the dollar signs.
Okay, I'm trying to go as cheap as possible in my brain. I would say the cheapest you could go, startup costs,
The investment.
$200, dollars,
Oh, that's not much.
cheapest. And
But
then
what would you recommend? Because
Is that-
I can.
that's different from what I would recommend, yeah.
Like I can cut out my own
Yeah,
business.
half of that. Yeah,
So I'm answering your question based on like what's the cheapest thing you could do to
What
start.
would be the best? Because cheap isn't always the best. So,
I mean, the
and I
best.
don't mean like the top
So hard
of
to
the line.
answer. The
Like,
best.
what's the right word?
There's no.
So if you're doing
I mean,
it yourself,
yeah.
you mean, or somebody would do it
No,
for you?
somebody else.
It's
You're-
relative.
you don't
I mean-
want to
Somebody,
do this.
you have to do it for her.
I'm doing it for you. I mean, and I can only answer for myself. Like it just depends on how frequently are we doing these episodes, what kind
Twice a
of
month,
Twice a
twice
month.
a month, yeah.
6 months.
Yeah.
Twice a month, 6 month engagement. What's a
About
11,
20 to
14?
20 to 40 minute episodes.
What? Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah, what's the average?
That was a
Off
good
the top of
idea.
my head.
What's an 11, 14 rate?
I mean, I'll answer that afterwards. How about that? Because I mean, I don't want to make it all about that. I mean, that's obviously what I do, but that's not.
What is 1114 from?
That is from my. There was a thing that I had with my my wife for years that I kept seeing the numbers 11, 14 everywhere, so it kind of became this weird thing. I'm not really superstitious, but it just got weird. So I was like, I think I'll name my studios after that. That's where it came from. Yeah, I mean, so I'll answer it this way. So $100, basically $200 would cover a really nice mic. There's free editing software. There's free everything you could
No,
want.
I'm saying not me do it. Someone else.
Hiring
do
somebody to do it?
I give my phone to my kids.
Yeah, I mean, anywhere from probably $1,500 to $2,500 to start up.
Okay.
And that would cover like all 5 first episodes and all the editing and distributing it
Okay.
to all the apps and all the music and all the mixing, everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 2,500 would be five.
That's what, 2.5 months?
Yeah, 2.5 months of that.
At least, yeah. Because you've got to get those. I typically tell people get the first 5 episodes out, right? Let's get the first 5 out to have them ready.
He charged me $10,000 just for the headache of dealing with me.
I mean, I didn't want to get into the price wars. Everybody's different, right?
Right.
But
You know, that's an interesting thing though, right? You know, the concept of hiring someone to do your podcast, when at its core, the podcast is about authenticity until you get to certain levels where
yeah, sure.
they tend to be much larger projects and organizations that can afford big teams and stuff like that. I think if you have a message worth sharing, a story worth sharing, again, I don't think people are going to be nearly as critical of
Quality.
doing it as,
Yeah.
as you may think. And so the idea of hiring someone to do it, just like when you try to hire a graphic designer or a web person sometimes, it's like by the time you have to answer all the questions, by the time you have to try to paint the vision for them and hope that they get it the way you get it, you probably look back and go, you know, I probably should have just done this myself.
Yeah, I think.
Except the power
yeah.
button. Like, I can't even get to the power button.
So that's my thing. My answer to that, my response to that is it depends on the person.
Yeah.
So why
What do
I
you
can,
have?
yeah, I can cut my own grass, figure out my plant stuff,
Yeah.
or in my time is worth more than my money, as people say, right? So
Exactly. How
then
much do you make?
it just depends, right? It just depends on what you
I
need.
see the value in, yes, having your own authentic, voice going into the podcast and not being too overproduced. But for me, half the barrier is I don't want to have to deal with all the other stuff. I can figure it all out, but I don't want to have to worry about, okay, getting it downloaded to this and the editing, even if it's not much
But that's
editing.
different now. Producing
Production,
is
yeah.
different
Yes.
than the content itself.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So if you're just saying, hey, Jonathan, I'm going to give you the audio of an interview I did with Justin,
Right.
That's different
Yeah.
than saying, hey, I want him to fully do the content. I don't want to record it. I don't want to do anything. I want him to do my podcast for me.
Got it. Yeah.
There's two
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It's
I
not
didn't
the
see
same.
those two levels. I saw the other level.
So my business model has shifted now in the last 2 years
Yeah.
to can I help somebody get started? That's my thing. If I can help them get started, give them a home studio, which is my goal with Gemma.
Yeah.
Here's the equipment you need. Let's get a home studio set up.
Yeah.
And when she's ready, and I'll still be here. Like if you want me to do whatever, I'll be here to help.
Right.
But fly birdie has kind of been my strategy now. Like you got this. Because if I could train them to do it, all the hard stuff, and then every now and then, hey, use me as a consultant. Can you edit this episode? I'm headed on vacation. Got it. Or be the coach on I'm struggling with this. How do I do that? But that's kind of how I've had to shift. I started with I'll be the whole thing, and then I realized people were either scared of the money or they were like, this seems too overwhelming. So then I had to scale it all back to, you know what? I will consult to get you to where you need to be. We'll get the first 5-10 episodes out. We'll get you launched out on all the apps. And then if you want to, I'll get home studio set up for you, and then you got this. And
I
so,
like it.
I
That's
like
how I've had to
that.
shift
I
because
really
of,
like that.
yeah, because of the whole time thing, like he's saying, expertise, yeah.
I have a technical question.
Okay.
So I have an office and it's got hardwood floors, kind of spacious. Now I noticed when I upgraded my new microphone, it limited a lot of the echoing. So how do you go about if you have an echo? Have you ever dealt with that?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, that biggest thing, Gerald's laughing. Yeah, go ahead. Time to go.
You can chat out there.
You could go out
get
there, yeah.
Coffee, do whatever. But I'm gonna just, first of all, Jonathan,
Yeah,
thank you.
sure, thank you guys.
Everyone,
Thank you.
And I'm gonna actually use a Gerald quote to pull us out of the meeting here. Everyone brings joy to a room. Some when they enter and some when they leave. So go bring
Wow.
joy to a room.
Get out of here.
Wow. Did you actually say that, Gerald? Did you actually say that?
Yes, on the Business X radio.
He said it. Did he say it at somebody, or was he just
No,
saying
I'm
it?
gonna be saying it at Business X radio. You guys, thank you. Stay tuned to the next Entrepreneurs. Take stickers.
You know, the worst part about that quote is when he says it to you and then he doesn't tell you which person you
Which
are.
you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He just says it and you're like,
That's for you. You know, things are supposed to marinate.
So my wife and I cannot
Think
not
about
drive
it.
by 92 and see your sign. And
Oh.
not